ahead of the budget, these are my views on the UK economy. I think the UK is now finally on the road to a sustainable recovery. If you look at the upgrades to forecasts over the last year, the OBR, for example, a year ago was predicting 1.8% growth for 2014. Now it's something like 2.7%. If you look at the growth in 2013, last year, achieved was 1.9%, and yet by the estimates in the middle of the year were half that level. So I think this is it. We have finally turned the economy round, and I think the economy could be a lot stronger than expected. Now, the reasons why are really quite simple. Reinhardt and Rogoff said a normal recession, thanks to their analysis, lasts about 9 to 12 months. Financial crisis, it's probably lasts twice that long. But global financial crises can take about 4 years from peak GDP to recovery. And in fact, that happened a year ago. We also found out about this time last year there was no triple dip. Then later we found out there was no double dip. And by about the end of the second quarter, there was already that turning point in the UK recovery. In fact, just at the point when the IMF downgraded, which is possibly the reason why it's dubbed by many in the city the Institute of Moronic Forecasting. So the financial profession is appallingly bad amplitude, and that's why turning points are so important, hence all their peculiar names, like, green shoots from Lamont and Carney with his escape velocity. What the financial profession tends to do is always underestimate amplitude. So they always underestimate how bad it gets in the downturn and how good it gets in the upside. And that's exactly what we've seen with upgrade after upgrade. And it's why a fund manager friend of mine always has a rule to sell on the first profit warning, because he says they're just like buses. They tend to come along in threes. So that's the idea. You've got downgrades, 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 and then you tend to see, as the turning point comes, upgrades, upgrades, upgrades. And we are in that upgraded position. That's why turning points are so important. So these are forecasts from the Bank of England, expecting about 3.4% growth in 2014, something like 2.7% in 2015, 2.9% in 2016. These are really good numbers. We've seen significant upgrades now to GDP. Now, the pessimists say, it's only thanks to record low interest rates. We've all become monetarists now. We think interest rates are the solution to every economic ill. We have bought the Friedman story. To me, that's way too optimistic. That's way too simplistic. Interest rates help, but they're not the be all and end all. Business does not decide to invest because interest rates are low. They decide to invest because the business and the outlook is looking a lot better. So why am I bullish on the UK economy? Well, consumer spending is strong, and I don't have concerns about that, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But corporate spending, I think there'll be a stampede to spend. And again, I'll come on to that in a minute. The US is the sort of engine for global growth, and the forecast for at least 3% growth this year and next, with pretty muted inflation. And the world growth figures, the world is back to growing. This is I think Goldman Sachs called it a year of transition. So this is the chart the bears love, household debt to income. The key line here is the orange line, household debt to income. You can see that, Britons have on average paid down debt from 160% debt to income to about 140%. That's typically what happens in a recession. However, the pessimists say, it's still up from sort of 100% in the end of the late 80s. And essentially, it's all a debt-fueled consumption, which is bad. Consumer growth is bad for an economy. Well, that's rubbish, because first of all, I have to point out that the British economy is sort of 60 to 70% consumption, and even in Germany it's 50%. So the idea that consumption is bad is rubbish. The second point I'd like to make is we're not in a position to be fussy about the quality of growth. Any growth pays back UK debt, and we have got so much of it, it just needs to be paid. The third line, the third comment I would say is that, Britons, like I said, have paid back debt, and in my view, I think we are just getting more used to debt. I think it's a structural shift, not just a cyclical shift. I think, if you look at young generation, I think they almost have no choice. University tuition fees are large. I didn't pay for my university tuition fees. Property is now very expensive, and business pension schemes are a thing of the past. Of course, the younger generation has to take on more debt. So this is, again, what the pessimists would use. This is loans to individuals, and credit card debt is in pink and unsecured debt is in orange. And as you can see, both of those have turned positive. And again, it's the idea that Britons are, going on a debt rampage again. Well, credit card growth in the early 2000s went up to almost 30%. It's currently only averaging 5%. That is not a debt fuel rampage. The same thing with unsecured lending. It's again growing at about 5%. In the boom years, it grew at 15%. It's not big growth. The other thing I would say is it sort of reminds me of my sister-in-law, Mandy Cooper. She recently went back to work full time. She's got 2 kids. And I said to her before she started work, what are you going to do with your first wage packet? Well, she laughed and she said, well, I've already spent it. And that was before she even started work. And I think consumers are a bit like my sister-in-law. They are spending wealth in anticipation of its arrival. They're looking at their business. They're seeing that trade is brisk. They're feeling more confident of more hours, a pay rise, even a promotion. And they are spending a little of their wealth ahead of time using credit cards and unsecured loans. And I think they're just adjusting their consumption ahead of that wealth to arrive. And therefore, that's why I am not bearish on this chart. So to me, this is a really important chart and shows us why we should not be worried about consumer debt. And the key thing here is the housing equity withdrawal, which is the blue line. In the 80s and in the 90s, the blue line shoots up as effectively Britons use their houses as cash point machines. They use their rising price of house to take money out of their houses and fuel consumption. Happened in the 80s, happened in the 90s. But if you look at the blue line now, it's still below zero. It's negative, which means Britons are on average still paying back their mortgages. There is no sign that houses are being used as cash points. This, to me, is the most important chart why we shouldn't be worried about consumer debt. Now, this is another chart for the bears. Self-employment has risen from 12% to over 14% since 2000. So, again, everyone says, oh, we're creating the wrong sort of jobs. This is the pessimist story. It's like the wrong sort of growth. I mean, the inherent pessimism around is, again, a sign of a past crisis because clearly it was right to be negative. So this is poor quality jobs, bad sort of unemployment. Well, to me, what this illustrates is the new working environment we all work in. It's easier now to make millions than almost at any time. You just have to create Angry Birds or Candy Crush. I don't just read the FT, I also read women's magazines occasionally. And I was reading about this woman mother with 2 kids, and she works from home editing Mumsnet, self-employed. Well, that job just would not exist 10 years ago because the internet didn't exist. And she couldn't do the work from home. And even what I do, blog about finance, I couldn't do this 10 years ago. So I think this shows the sort of new technologically different way that we now work. And I don't think it's a bad thing. People are working for themselves. This is an automatic response from the bears to say this is bad. I think it's a sign of a new and modern economy. Another chart for the glass half empty people is the part-time employees who could not find full-time work. So people are not working at their full capacity, how much they want to work. Well, to me, I look at this chart and say, this is great news for the ability of private business to have a flexible and adaptable workforce, and that actually increases British competitiveness. And it indicates that the output gap in the UK should be quite considerable because British business has not fired its workers. They've kept them on. They've kept those staff on. And that means those staff, they may only be working part-time, but they're not losing their skills. They are not de-skilling whilst out of work. So again, there are 2 ways to read this chart, and I prefer to go for the glass half full way. Now, this to me is the key chart. We've got consumer growth. I think it will continue, and I'm not worried about consumer debt. The next thing I think we'll get is businesses spending. There will be, in my opinion, a stampede to spend because companies have not got their checkbooks out for 5 years. So if you look at this chart, the green line is the investment intentions, which has shot up. The purple line is ONS business investment, and it doesn't actually include the latest data from the fourth quarter GDP numbers, which showed business investment up 8.5% year on year. So it's turned around rapidly. Businesses have used low interest rates to refinance cheaply and in some cases to do share buybacks. The signs of a stronger economy will finally cause them to invest. And I think this is the key, the stampede to spend by businesses, and hopefully that will help with the productivity, low productivity in the UK as well. So now looking at the risks to the UK economy. Now clearly you've got slowdown in China, which has been a top theme for last year. You've got the Eurozone, European parliamentary elections in May. We've got a bit of a legal threat to the OMT in Europe. We've got another Italian government, concerns about the midterm elections in Washington, blah, blah. But I will focus on my specific UK risks, which is inflation, trade figures, Mr. Carney and labour productivity. So this again is Bank of England CPI projections, and I love the fact with the target at with the targeted inflation at 2%, pretty much every number is either 1.8 or 1.9%, which makes me laugh and illustrates the stupidity of economic forecasting. However, the Bank of England is slightly taking comfort from the deflationary pressures in the Eurozone, HICP data out 0.7% year on year for February, and the US CPI data as well, which is around 1%. But to me, I think inflation is much more localised. And I think once the economy gets going, Mark Carney will leave rates too low and threaten us with inflation. I think particularly it will come this time from wage rises, which is that's not where it's originated from for the last 6 years. Staff have not had a wage rise for years. And I think there's a lot of pent up demand from employees to see their wages go up. So to me, I fear that we will be too complacent on inflation. My next worry is on the trade data. So this is, as you can see, two bar charts with the contributions to GDP, to growth, to output for the 2012 and 2013. The sort of turquoise line and the green line come from housing investment and business investment, both of which were a drag in 2012 but contributed to GDP in 2013. However, the bar, which is underlined for both years, is net trade. Net trade has been a drag on GDP for the UK for 2012 and 2013, and quite a large drag on trade. And my concern is it will continue to be so. This is a exchange trade-weighted sterling figure. You can see the big devaluation in sterling post the financial crisis. The same kind of devaluation happened to the dollar. And yet the US exports tripled, and yet UK exports only went up about 30%. So even when sterling devalues, exports don't really increase as much as they should. What's happened recently, of course, is that sterling has strengthened quite considerably, over 10% since March, which makes British industries uncompetitive. So, I'm slightly concerned that with, Japan and the Eurozone still stimulating from a monetary perspective, whereas the UK tightening, or seem to be tightening, or will be tightening soon, sterling strength will continue. And that really is poor for trade. So my third risk is Mark Carney. He makes me quite nervous, and not in a George Clooney kind of way. He was clearly a political hire by Osborne to deliver growth to help the Tories win the election. Now, specifically what concerns me at the moment is Forward Guidance Mark II, because he's now targeting the output gap. And my problem with the output gap is who the hell knows what it is. And to me, this chart illustrates it. It's sort of various estimates of capacity utilisation from the CBI, the British Chamber of Commerce and various other places. And you can see there's a wide divergence of views. The Bank of England thinks the output gap's about 1 to 1.5% of GDP, but who the hell knows? It depends on the speed of obsolescence of both equipment and human skills. So, how long can an IT engineer working as a cabbie retain the necessary skills and knowledge to return to his prior and more productive occupation? No idea. Can a mothballed factory be put back to efficient and profitable use? Who knows? I mean, Carney thinks there is enough surplus capacity in the economy to ensure it will not be eliminated for at least 3 years, so inflation will be well contained. Well, I hope he's right, because once inflation lets loose, then it kind of rips through the economy. And I will just say, just remind you that back in August, when the Bank of England was going for forward guidance 1, targeting unemployment, that what they said about the output gap was that it was unobservable, difficult to explain, and any estimate is subject to substantial uncertainty. And yet that is now what they're targeting. And then finally, the risk clearly is labour productivity. It's been great that unemployment has remained so robust through this recession. However, clearly with little GDP growth, it's impacted very heavily on productivity. Now, productivity falls have happened across all the Western countries. It's not just the UK. And in fact, Italy is worse than the UK. But clearly for a successful Britain, this does need to improve. So we need to watch the productivity numbers closely. And I have to end with this great quote from Keynes: "When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir?" And I would remind all the bears out there of this great quote, because clearly it's been right to be bearish, but there's still a lot out there. Now, growth makes all the difference because it enables us to pay back debt. Mario Draghi at the ECB made a fundamental difference. It's a very different institution under Trichet. The UK has entered the crisis after the US and before the Eurozone, and it's coming out of it after the US and before the Eurozone. It is already back and recovering strongly. I think the recovering strongly will eventually give Osborne a little more money to play around with ahead of the election, but that won't happen in the budget, this week's budget. It'll happen, I think, in a year's time.